Marie Claire, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. I've been involved with Sabeel since 2015, so it's a real honor to be with all of you today. Thank you so much for joining us for our 12th Kumi online gathering. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping points to cover so that this session can run as smoothly as possible. This session is being broadcast live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you would quickly share the Facebook post on Facebook so that others may join and watch this session. We will be muting everyone during this session except those speaking. If you wish to ask a question of the speakers, please type it into the chat box. When it comes to questions at the end of the session, we'll be using the questions shared in the chat or from other questions received earlier by email. If you have any technical issues, please message the Kumi team privately and we will try to help you with them. We hope that you will find this session interesting and informative. I'd like to start by having everyone you see today introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Hamid.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Bassam Abu Hamad from Al-Quds University. I am the director of the School of Public Health in Gaza. Also, I am the Near East Council of Churches Health Consultant. I work with them to support their work and activities in Gaza. In addition, I am the regional director for the Gender and Adolescents Global Evidence, which is a longitudinal research looking for what works to support adolescents in the MENA region.
I'd now like to welcome Kyle to introduce himself.
Thank you. Really pleasure to be with you all this morning or afternoon. My name is Khaled Quzmar, and I serve as the Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations at Churches for Middle East Peace. Churches for Middle East Peace, for those of you who are not aware, is a coalition of nearly 30 national Christian communions and organizations that span the Christian theological perspective, so most of the mainline Protestant churches in the US, Catholic, Orthodox, Evangelical, and Historic Peace churches. And we are an advocacy group that really pushes and encourages the US government to enact policies that will help result in just and lasting ends to conflicts in the Middle East, with particular attention to Israel-Palestine. So I'm really happy to be with you all again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you both shortly. Now, as some of our regulars may have noticed from the title of today's session, we're doing things a bit differently. So since we've begun these online gatherings, people have been asking us to hear more about the annexation. So while Netanyahu's plans for annexation have been stalled, they have by no means gone away. So in scheduling this gathering, Kyle from Churches for Middle East Peace informed us that they were working on a Churches Against Annexation campaign, and we immediately knew that this was something that our Kumi Now members should know about and should get involved with. However, we also don't want to turn our backs on Gaza and the topic of this week's Kumi entry, Living in Gaza Under Blockade, and the associated Kumi Action. Dr. Bassam Hamid graciously offered to step in and give us an update on the conditions in Gaza from the ground and what has changed since our publication of the first edition of Kumi Now 2 years ago. So we begin with Dr. Hamid in Gaza. After he has spoken, Kyle will briefly reflect on CMEP's work in Gaza since they created the Kumi Now entry. He will then move on to talk about the threat of annexation to the West Bank and CMEP's current campaign. Both guests will then be available for the question and answer session, so feel free to ask questions about both Gaza and the West Bank. I'm sure that in this process, we will better understand the parallels and differences between Israel's treatment of Gaza and its treatment of the West Bank. And of course, we will leave you with actions that you can take anywhere around the world to raise awareness of both situations and oppose the blockade of Gaza and the annexation of the West Bank. So now, let us turn to Gaza. Before Dr. Hamid takes over, I'd like to give you a 1-minute reminder of what CMEP shared in their Kumi Now entry, Living in Gaza under Blockade. So obviously Gaza has a long history, and this is just going to be a very short overview beginning with 2006. If you're interested in getting more background, we'll have time for that in the question and answer period, and Dr. Hamid will also be able to fill us in on more of that. So in short, in 2006, Hamas came into power in Gaza. Israel then imposed a blockade on Gaza, and that blockade has lasted to this day. During this time, there has been ongoing periods of conflict between Hamas and Israel in the Gaza Strip, and it's important to really emphasize that this conflict has been asymmetrical. And what I mean by that is that Israel controls the borders of Gaza and has advanced military weapons. Because of this, the result has been the decimation of Gaza's infrastructure, in particularly leading to an energy crisis, as roughly only 1/3 of Gaza's energy needs are met. Gaza's water needs are similarly underserved, and its broken wastewater treatment system contributes to polluting the groundwater. Gaza is surrounded by a wall and naval blockade, which similarly limits or closes access to the sea for Gazan fishermen. It has 2 border crossings, one to Israel and one to Egypt. The limited medical infrastructure in Gaza means that many Gazans must seek medical care elsewhere, but they aren't allowed to do so. Gaza has often been compared to a prison, and the UN has warned that it has become unlivable and unsustainable. Dr. Hamad, this was a very short history of Gaza up to 2 years ago. Would you like to add anything or talk about any changes in the intervening years?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very informative introduction. Yeah, so indeed, the issues and the problems in Gaza started even before the 2006, and I'm sure that most of the participants are familiar with the context, but just as a reminder, see, Gaza is a small strip of land. It's only 360 kilometers. It's around less than a quarter the size of London, and this very tiny place is home to more than 2 million people. 66% of them are refugees. So Gaza is a nation of refugees, yeah, and the majority of people were forced to leave their houses, which has been demolished during the war 1948 or the other subsequent war after that. The population in Gaza is very young. Around half of the population are children, yeah, and youth bulge is around 50%, which has implications, yeah, in terms of employment, in terms of the future, the psychosocial issues, and the youth bulge can be a gift for any nation, or it also can threaten the civil, the civil peace in that community if that issue is not being dealt with. The population in Gaza grows rapidly at 3% every year. In 2050, the population of Gaza will be around 5 million. Yeah, and for the first time, the population will be higher than that of the West Bank. The population density in Gaza is around 5,500 per 1 square kilometer. This is like the general density, yeah, which is not state density nor a city density. So because Gaza is not a state and not a city, however, in refugee camps, it could reach up to 70,000 per 1 square kilometer, which may be the highest in the world, even higher than Dhaka in Bangladesh. Indeed, the population in Gaza, which was once a thriving center for culture, education, trade, Yeah, so has really suffered from recurrent occupations, Israeli blockade, Israeli de-development, deliberate policies, as Sarah Roy described it. So it's not just happened, but there were Israeli deliberate policies to destroy the economy and the blockade and the Israeli aggression. So I don't want really to call them war, because usually the war between two armies, while here it's more of aggression on people, which destroyed almost all the life aspect except the dignity of the people and their strong desire, to stand up and survive and live in freedom. Unlike different other places in the world, usually there is development curve and development line, while in Gaza you will see that things are go back. So it's unlike other countries. Usually people speak about the past, so now they have more access to electricity, more access to employment, more access to travel, but the situation in Gaza, it goes in the opposite, and usually, so as time goes, so more restrictions and more suffering people suffer by the time due, to the progressive de-development policies and the contextual issues. However, after Oslo Agreement, people have great expectations, because politicians from both sides made brave noises, being like Singapore, but it ended like it's less than Tora Bora even, So, so there was a promise of being Singapore, and there will be economic prosperity. However, Israel declared that Gaza, no prosperity, when they declared Gaza as a hostile entity in 2007. They said there will be no prosperity, no economic growth, and no humanitarian crisis. However, the signs of a humanitarian crisis are obvious. From 2014 till now, even after the publishing of the report 2 years ago, the total number of people who were killed in Gaza during including the number killed during the Great March of Return in 2018 and 2019, 2,700 people killed, and around 50,000 people were injured. Around 1/3 of them are children, and the other third are women, and many of them injured, serious injuries, and they acquire disability, which will remain with them forever. 90% of people in Gaza, according to BCBS, were exposed to Israeli violence at least once in their life. So the majority of people are traumatized by the violence of occupation, and really the occupational de-development policies, which includes not only wars, but even the economic policies and the pressure they put in the economy and in the livelihood of people, like controlling energy sources, prevention of people of movement. All these really contributed to the destruction of the livelihood and the assets and affected the psychosocial of the people. Indeed, in addition to that, with the internal division and the war between Fatah and Hamas, and the imposing of the international blockade, especially by the Israelis on Gaza, people movements were too much restricted. Your chance of leaving Gaza is once every 12 years. We were doing a research, and you see a picture in the background, the wall. Here, one of the adolescents mentioned, because I cannot travel, so I am carrying a model of the globe on my hands, and it's written in in my hands, siege and the freedom, and I am wearing bracelets, free Gaza, because this is the issue as adolescents we are facing. As a result of these policies of occupation, the closure, the blockade, the GDP in Gaza is similar to the GDP we have in 1994, although the population has increased by 230%. So the GDP per capita is only 1,000, which is less than half of that in the West Bank. The unemployment rate is increasing. It was 22 in 2004. Then in 2018, it reaches 35. Now it's more than 50. It's the higher unemployment rate all over the world. The food security, we used to have in 2018 around 65% food insecurity. Recently, we conducted a study during the COVID-19, so it jumped to 75. So the number of people who used to get to apply for social protection programs, which provide some kind of assistance in terms of food to people. So it jumped from 50,000 in 2014 now to 76,000 are receiving cash assistance through the government, mainly donated by the World Bank and the European Union. In terms, you mentioned about water, so we used to speak about that only 5% of Gaza municipality drinking wells are suitable for human use. Now this reached to 0, so because it decreased to 3%, now none of the Gaza municipality drinking well meets neither the international standards nor even the Palestinian standards. And what complicated the issue is the electricity problem, where the 3 major desalination units are not working, and sewage are still pumped much more than before into the sea. Every day around 1 million liters of raw sewage pumped to the sea, and 35% of the water sea and on the sites we examined through WHO are contaminated with feces, either human or animal feces. This just gives example about the level of pollution. Already you talked about electricity. I am sitting here, at the university because there is solar energy. As of today, the Israelis last week stopped entry of fuel, which is needed for the most famous electricity power plant in the world, because it has been mentioned in the news more than any plant, not because of its size or because of its efficiency. It's more because of the problems, because every day the Israelis allow, one day they allow the entry of fuel and the other day they stop it. So it's the most frequently mentioned all over the world, which only produces around 60 megawatt, while the needs of Gaza is increasing by time. Now we need around 600 megawatts. We receive another 30 from Egypt and around 170 from Israel. However, Israel reduced the power supply to 70, so we are living in around 30%, 70% of our needs for electricity are not met, and you can imagine the consequences of that in the psychosocial status of the people, in the health. Now, when people visit each other, so they really ask about the electricity, whether they will have electricity, especially electricity is needed. Many people live in towers. Water is needed to pump water for the storage, tank roof. There are violence because of electricity. There is psychological distress, which really harm people a lot. In terms of health, unlike other countries in the world, which usually face one kind of a problem, we face three. So we face triple burden of the disease. We face 3 major problems. We face the diseases related to stress, and industrialization, because people are always worried. We have the diseases related to poverty, poor sanitation, especially anemia and malnutrition. In addition, we also are highly exposed to injuries related to Israeli aggressions and hostilities, in addition to lack of safety measures, like accidents is the first killer among children from 1 year to 5 years because of these measures. We have very high prevalence of hypertension. Yeah, recently we conducted a study during COVID, so it was around 40%. Diabetes, so yes, around 30% of people suffer from diabetes. Cancer is also increasing with a rate of around 270 per 100,000 population, which is higher than the other countries in the region. Indeed, we did not make any progress in reducing the infant mortality rate in the past 15 years. Indeed, it has been increased recently. If we compare the number of women who died because of delivery, we achieved in 2018 10%. In 2019, this jumped to 30 30 per 100,000 live birth. So the number has increased by around 300 times in the last year due to the deterioration of the economic conditions, the deterioration of services, because these indicators really are not purely medical, rather they reflect the contextual issues, because in general 85% of the determinant of health are not health facility related. It's mainly related to context, to poverty. In terms of access, usually in ordinary condition, people have good access to services. There are adequate number of facilities. So access to basic services is there. However, access is restricted during crisis, during Israeli aggressions, and also it has been restricted by lack of equipment and lack of disposables and lack of medications. In the best scenario, 40% of the essential drugs that are listed in the Palestinian essential drugs are lacking due to lack of resources. In addition, Israelis also don't allow the entry of medications, for certain medications, so they don't allow the entry. In addition, also to the political division between West Bank and Ramallah. Access to specialized services is really a challenge. Like, for example, for cancer, we don't have in Gaza, the Israelis did not allow for us to have radiotherapy, for example, for people with cancer. And this service is only provided in the West Bank or outside Gaza at least, So we will have to travel and to get permit from Israel, which is not always provided, and in many cases they denied the permit. In addition to obstacles related to coordination, lack of resources, and people suffer because of that. In Gaza, there are around 16,000 people with cancer who are receiving little support. Most of the chemotherapy are out of stock. Many of them are denied from going for West Bank to get treatment at Augusta Victoria Hospital, and they have to live with their suffering. I used to say they are unable to live, unable even to die, even because palliative care, access to palliative care is not available. Yes, there is access to basic services, but for specialized services, we don't have because of the siege and the closure. The physicians in Gaza are not being exposed to travel outside. They're not always they are allowed, and they think 100 times. Also, there are no resources to train them. In Gaza, only we have one neonatologist to take care of baby who need nursery, while we need 60 according to the international standards. We have 1 or 2 psychiatrists, while we need at least 60. So we have one person who does open heart surgery, and he's Palestinian Spanish, and he's working in contract supported by Qatar. We don't have adequate number of neurologists. We don't have adequate number of orthopedic surgeons. So the access to specialized services is really at risk. And theoretically, there is health insurance. Around 80% of people have health insurance, but the health insurance coverage is very limited, and it's becoming more and more limited, especially due to a lack of medication, inadequate medication, lack of resources, and employees are not being the staff. In terms of Corona, which is really another layer, so there was a lot of worry for Corona and its subsequent policies. However, we are lucky that we don't have many cases of Corona. We have 91 cases. Yes, we conducted limited number of tests, only 18,000 tests, but there is strict measures at 2 crossings, and everyone is entering Gaza is put in quarantine for at least 21 days, and this really has contributed to controlling the spread of the disease. But if there will be community transmission, it's going to be big disaster, especially we don't have resources. Just one example for that. In Gaza, we have only 40 40 ventilators for 2 million people, which means 20 ventilators for around each 1 million. While in Israel, there are 50 ventilators for 100,000. So imagine, so if there will be crisis, and we in health sector, we expected that there will be around at least 20,000 people having the disease at the same time. However, Corona complicated the life of people, the access to food. Many people lost their income, so the unemployment is now more and more. We conducted a study recently to see the impact of Corona, and we found that 82% of people are not working. With the also closure, health facilities is becoming more restricted, especially for maternity services with women and adolescents are facing a problem, family planning suspended, for example, antenatal care, and most of the focus shifted to Corona. In terms of psychosocial issues, which I think is very important, the long incubation, the recurrent incubations, the feeling that this is will never end one day, the Israeli aggressions and with its scars, the psychological scars sometimes are even worse than the physical injuries. The chronic unemployment, the chronic poverty people are suffering are the main driver really for psychosocial illnesses. Many people in Gaza suffer from frustration, depression, loss of hope. They show anxiety disorders, symptoms of PTSD. UNRWA estimates that 75% of UNRWA school children need urgent psychosocial support. UNICEF estimates that 50% of Gaza children recently are showing signs of post-traumatic stress syndrome, so they show symptoms. Among adults, we found that 30% recently, 30% of people, when we assess the general health using the International General Health Questionnaire tool, we found that 30% of people are showing signs of caselessness. So they need further follow-up to be treated. So these are like the major psychosocial problem people are facing. In addition to that, so we noticed that there are more cases of sexual harassment, more spread of violence in the community, more GBV. Only 4% of parents last year admitted that they use non-violent methods. So the majority are using violence again in parenting and disciplining their children. There is 51% of Gazans women are exposed to violence by husbands because men are unemployed and not working, and they provide symbols of failure for their children and families. So this affected their psychosocial status, and they reflect that on the people who are surrounding them, and there is like a cycle of violence in the community. We see more cases of suicide also, so more desire to migrate. 37% of youth in Gaza reported they wish to migrate, temporary migration. mainly for economic reasons, also because they think that there is hope. At the side of service provision in mental health, there are some psychosocial interventions, mostly provided in response to crisis, short-sighted, donor-oriented programs, but we lack specialized mental health services. We don't have enough number of psychiatrists. Only 2 facilities in Gaza providing advanced and specialized mental health services, and usually access is also restricted, especially for adolescent girls, by social norms and social barriers, which also contributes to psychosocial problems facing children, particularly girls. Having said that, despite that, there are many achievements and good, in terms of education, almost, especially among girls, we got good in Human Development Index 0.677 due to women education, women participation, working force is not that bad. So despite all the problems, so I believe that a moon will rise from my darkness, as Darwish is saying. So there is hope, and despite all the difficulties, we are sure that, we can overcome these, and we will have our independence, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid, for that wonderful and in-depth overview of what's happening in Gaza. I know there's still so much more to talk about. We will be able to get into that more during the question answer period. And for those of you who can stick around, we'll have an informal conversation after this session where we can go into more depth. I'd now like to turn to Kyle with CMEP. I just want to invite Kyle to add any further thoughts he has on the topic of Gaza, since CMEP has been involved in the region for a while. And then we'll move on to hearing about the ongoing annexation in the West Bank.
Thank you, and thank you for that overview, Dr. Abu Hamad. I'm not going to add much. I would just say, in terms of CMEP's continued advocacy, primarily over these past 2 years, we've really been doing a lot on Capitol Hill and with the administration, trying to encourage that the US resume humanitarian assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, and also to resume assistance to UNRWA, which Dr. Abu Hamad referenced. As many of you know, in the US, under the Trump administration, we have completely cut off all humanitarian assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, as well as to UNRWA. We know that humanitarian aid is not a political solution, but in light of the suffering and the real dire situation in Gaza, for the interim period, we think that the US must continue to provide these funds, while we, of course, also continue to advocate for a durable solution to the political issues as well. So we've seen some positive instances here in the US and Congress of members of Congress speaking out and trying to encourage those funds to come back within our own process of appropriations and budget. It was good a few weeks ago that in the House of Representatives here in the US, they did include within their budget for fiscal year 2021 some funds for humanitarian assistance in the West Bank and Gaza, and funds that could also be used by UNRWA. That also now needs to, in our system, pass the Senate before it can be signed by the president. So there's still work ahead of us, but we're continuing primarily to advocate in that regard. So that's really all I add about Gaza, and then I guess I'll just go into annexation.
Yes, please feel free just to share with us what's going on with the annexation and what Churches for Middle East Peace is doing.
Yeah, I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll give an overview. I know many of you who are on have been following very closely and are experts yourselves. Just a bit of a background, we sort of started to see within the Israeli political scene a shift toward annexation becoming more of the mainstream conversation in 2016. Prior to that, it had been something mostly advocated by the ultra right-wing settler parties, but in 2016 there was a bit of a shift, and then we fast forward even more to 2019. I know many of you have been following the past year. Israel has had quite a bit of internal political issues where the political parties have been deadlocked. So Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Likud party have had to go through 3 elections over the past year or so. And in 2019, April 2019, at a campaign rally where he was trying to make it so that he would only have to do 1 election, the Prime Minister said that if Likud was returned to power, that he would begin the process of formal annexation, de jure annexation of parts of Area C. I know, many of us already know that per the Oslo Accords, the West Bank was divided into 3 areas, areas A and B, where a majority of Palestinians live and have some control, Israel, some control, Palestinian, the West Bank, Palestinian officials under the PA have some control over those areas, and then of course Area C, where Israel has retained full control over all internal and security matters. It was supposed to be transferred to the Palestinians again as part of the Oslo Accords, but that has not happened. So Prime Minister Netanyahu began to use this as a campaign issue and has said that all or most of Area C, where all of the Israeli settlements are, but also where at 60% of Palestinian land, resource rich, includes the Jordan Valley. If we think about a future Palestinian state, the Jordan Valley and Area C would be where a lot of resources for the Palestinians would come from. So this would be devastating for any prospect of a Palestinian state. It's not entirely clear yet what exactly the Prime Minister would fully annex. That's not, they're working privately on that. But what is clear is that should this annexation proceed, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been clear that the Palestinians who live in Area C in the annexed land would not be granted citizenship, would not be granted special rights. It's very possible that they would be transferred to areas A or B, so they would be cut off from their historic land. Finally, just earlier this year, after a few elections, there was the coalition government was formed. So Prime Minister Netanyahu joined forces with his previous arch opponent, Benny Gantz, and part of that coalition agreement, which allowed for Netanyahu to stay in power, was that annexation could proceed, and that it could proceed as early as July 1. As a US-based organization, we're interested in the US context, and what we know is that the annexation plans are done in close collaboration with the US administration, and in fact, the annexation that we expect of parts of Area C have been green-lighted by the US administration and were part of President Trump's Peace to Prosperity proposal for Israel-Palestine that was released in January of this year. So they continue to work, Israeli and US officials continue to work closely together to try to come up with a map. We still don't know what that would look like, but we know that regardless of what it would look like, it would mean the mass expropriation of Palestinian land and denial of rights to the Palestinians. So we know that creeping annexation has been an issue for decades, right? So we've seen the expansion of settlements, we've seen Palestinian homes and other structures be demolished, we've seen the denial of permits for Palestinians to build land. So some people will say, is this really any different? You know, like, hasn't this already been going on? And while we acknowledge that this has been going on, again, for decades, we do see that the process of formal de jure annexation would indeed be significant and would indeed take this a step further so that it really codifies into law, you know, because all of the settlements, all of the Israelis in the settlements would now become Israeli citizens officially, and it codifies then and entrenches inequalities against Palestinians and would make again, it very, very difficult for you to see any prospect of a Palestinian state. So Israel would be, if annexation does move forward, you know, Israel would be in complete control of Palestinian airspace and territorial waters. Palestinians, like I said, in annexed areas would not be given citizenship or special rights. So this would include the expropriation of Palestinian land. Movement for Palestinians would be within the West Bank. Obviously, Dr. Abu Hamad has talked about the challenges of movement for Palestinians in Gaza, which is different, but movement for Palestinians in the West Bank would be even more difficult than it is today. And for those of you that have been to the West Bank, you know that it is already difficult, but there would be increased checkpoints. They would have to travel. It wouldn't be, as easy to get from point A to point B in the West Bank without having to go through what is now considered Israel. So there would need to be permits or checkpoints, and it would make that incredibly more challenging. Churches for Middle East Peace, we obviously are connected and concerned about the sustainability of the Christian community in Palestine, and we've heard directly from our Christian partners in the West Bank how this will impact their ability to freely worship, to offer the social services and educational services that they provide to the most vulnerable, and really to the long-term sustainability and viability of the Christian community. So it's a particular concern to us. And given that just yesterday, the president here said that he moved the embassy and recognized the capital of Israel's Jerusalem for the evangelicals, a lot of these actions are done. And they're said that they're done for the Christians in the US, but we wanted to make sure at CMEP that folks knew, especially within the US government and with Congress, that there was strong opposition to annexation from a Christian perspective. And so we launched this spring, Churches Against Annexation Campaign, which provided, again, the clear voice that Christians are not unilaterally in support of annexation, that there are diverse voices. So we provide churches and individuals with opportunities to amplify this message via social media, to make sure that their congressional members know this through action alerts. And it's been an important part of our annual convening that we had to do virtually this year, given the pandemic. But we've also then helped organize a letter that was signed by 27 church leaders to Congress opposing annexation and asking Congress then to enact tangible consequences should Israel proceed. I later, during the Q&A, I can put in the chat box some of our annexation-specific resources that you all can look at. Just briefly, I want to talk about some of the responses that we've seen to annexation from the international community with an emphasis on the US. I know that some folks here, not all folks are joining from the US, but again, our focus at CMEP is on US-based advocacy, so that's where my expertise is in. But across the board, we've seen fairly strong condemnation of annexation from world leaders. So there was over in late June, more than 1,000 European MPs from 25 countries signed on to a letter opposing annexation, noting that it would be fatal to the prospects of Israel-Palestinian peace. You had Angela Merkel, Macron, Boris Johnson, King Abdullah. Jordan has been very, very vocal, and Jordan is a key voice here in the US as well as the governments of Australia and South Africa, just to name a few. So we've seen that there has been a strong outcry from the international community. The emphasis has varied. For some, it's situated and contextualized within concern for Palestinians. Other times it is contextualized within the impact annexation would have on the of the peace process, and others concerned about the security and safety of Israel and its democracy should they proceed with annexation. So there have been different angles, but there has been fairly wide spread and strong condemnation of annexation from world leaders, which I think has played a part in why we're seeing annexation, at least not happening formally yet. So just to name a few of the responses within Congress, and then I'll wrap up so we can have time for questions. We have seen members of Congress, again, with various angles, send messages against annexation to the president, to the prime minister, to Secretary Pompeo. So we saw Senators Murphy from Connecticut, Kane from Virginia, and Van Hollen from Maryland organized a letter, and they were joined by 16 of their colleagues that cautioned against Israel against unilateral annexation, but did not share in that letter what, if any, repercussions the government of Israel would face should they proceed. That letter went directly to Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. Over 190 Democrats in the House, so that is most of the Democrats in the House, signed a letter organized by Congresswoman Schakowsky, Congressman Price, Congressman Schneider, and Congressman Deutsch. That's a pretty significant number to have that many Democrats. Again, the letter focused less on the implications of annexation for Palestinians and more on what might happen to Israel's security and the prospect of a two-state solution. But it was good to see so many Democrats signing on to a letter. Many of you might have heard of a stronger letter that was organized by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez from New York. She was joined by 12 of her House colleagues and by Senator Bernie Sanders in probably the strongest letter that we've seen from a member of Congress that was public around Israel-Palestine, where they explicitly said that should the Israeli government continue down this path of annexation, we will work to ensure non-recognition of annexed territories, as well as pursue legislation that conditions the $3.8 billion in US military funding to Israel to ensure that the US taxpayers are not supporting annexation in any way. So I can also include a copy of that letter if folks are interested. So that's big, you know, to the point where most of the Democrats have come out against annexation. There was also legislation as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act introduced by Senator Van Hollen that would ensure that no US funds to Israel were used for annexation. That did not pass, but there were 13 senators that supported it. Unfortunately, it has become a bit of a partisan issue. So there were a number of Republican letters that were released, one including 116 House Republicans that supported annexation that was sent directly to Netanyahu. There was a counter letter to the letter led by AOC sent to Secretary Pompeo saying that that letter was anti-Semitic and that should it not be supported. And then 7 Republicans also wrote a letter in support of annexation. So unfortunately, you know, for CMEP, we think it should be opposed regardless of your political leanings, and we work with Republicans and Democrats across the board to try to get that message across. But we have seen it as a bit of a partisan issue coming up now in the US. The last thing that I'll note is that there was some pretty significant news on Friday. Congresswoman Betty McCollum introduced legislation, HR 8050, the Israeli Annexation Non-Recognition Act. She was joined by 6 of her colleagues, and if you go to CMEP's website, we have an action alert, and you can also see the folks that joined her. But this would prohibit the US from formally recognizing or providing US aid to any areas of the occupied West Bank annexed by the government of Israel in violation of international law. So no US funds could be used to deploy or support the deployment of personnel, training services, lethal materials, equipment, or other activity in territory that's unilaterally annexed. So that's really significant to see that legislation come out. It came on the cusp of this, you know, normalization agreement between the UAE and Israel, which was reported incorrectly by, at least initially, by a lot of the news that said annexation was now off the table, that was part of the agreement. It's actually not part of the agreement. What is said is that annexation will be suspended, and it doesn't say for how long, but Prime Minister Netanyahu made clear that he was asked to prioritize getting out this normalization agreement with the UAE above annexation, but that he would continue to push for annexation. So the agreement between the UAE and Israel does nothing to stop the threat of annexation. And so we need to continue to be attuned to what's going on. If you're viewing this and you're in the US, I would encourage you to take action. We have the CMEP action alert. There are other groups that you might have already received information from, but really to press your congressional member to support this legislation. And if they have already supported it, to thank them, because I know that all of the members are going to get some significant pushback for supporting this. I'll stop there so that we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you, Dr. Hamid. This has been a very informative session. We have many questions to choose from, and there probably won't be time to get through all of them. So I'd just like to remind everyone that you can stay afterwards for our informal discussion time, and we will have time to go into more depth with all of the questions that have been asked of us today. I'm going to start with a question that follows what Kyle was just speaking about. I have a question that's asking for more information about the Israeli and UAE deal and its impact. And in that regard, what Mohammed Dalin's influence and power in Gaza is. And so either Dr. Hamid or Kyle, you would be welcome to both answer this question.
Yeah, I can really only speak to the first part of how it impacts annexation, which is pretty much what I just said, that it's temporary, that it's not going to stop annexation. I know that the deal has not officially been signed yet, but was released, and I know that it will encourage a lot of joint business ventures and embassy, a UAE embassy in Israel and Israeli embassy in the UAE. So there's I think a lot of economic aspects that they're pushing for. I can't really speak to this part.
Dr. Hamid, do you have anything to say to the second part about Mohammed Dahlan and his influence and power in Gaza?
See, I'm not a politician, by the way, so I'm academic, but I will try to answer as much as I can. I think the agreement is going to isolate more the Palestinians and also to encourage Israel to be more hostile with the Palestinians, because Israel will think now it's being more supported, and I think the Gulf countries are even going to provide support to Israel, including financial support. For Mohammed Dahlan, he has some influence in Gaza, and he implements some projects and provides some assistance to people, like loans to university students. He is also helping some sick people to get treatment. Now his supporters in Gaza advocates that United Arab Emirates will advocate the Palestinian case, and this is not going to affect the Palestinian case, and it's going also even to be helpful. But I think on the ground there is some kind of agreement between the Dahlan and Hamas and other political parties about how to manage the resources he is getting from Emirates. I think this agreement is going to negatively affect the Dahlan, and I think there will be more restriction in his activities in Gaza, because in West Bank he does not play any role, because there Abu Mazen, he has a big issue with Abu Mazen, and he's not doing any activities there, while in Gaza there's kind of agreement how to manage the resources. There is a national committee which includes all political parties except the formal Fatah Abu Mazen. But I think this agreement is going to negatively affect. So especially now Fatah and Abu Mazen, and the issue of the normalization between Israel and Emirates, they are in agreement and they coordinate. So one of the points I think that I think the Dahlan is going to be a scapegoat for this agreement. Personally.
Thank you, both of you. That was helpful. The next question I have is this. If you look at the 1978-1979 Drobel's plan, which was the basis of the Israeli settlement policy from that time onward, in terms of how it viewed settlements and future borders, the 2020 Peace to Prosperity Plan is almost an exact replica of that map. And there's an article in Foreign Policy recently on this. And the person who asked this question says, "This makes me feel that this was part of the plan all along, and that there was never a full faith Israeli effort or desire to give Palestinians a state. So what does this mean for future negotiations? How can Palestinians trust that any negotiation with Israel will be in full faith?"
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we could have a session just on that. I think that is definitely a viewpoint that is shared. And I speak mostly from a US perspective, where we've heard for the past several years, even before the Trump administration, that the US has not been viewed as an honest broker. So the same faith, bad faith accusations could go against the US as well. And so I can't really speak to how a Palestinian will feel better about it, but I think that's part of the reason. And I don't think this fully answers your question. So I welcome more input from you, Doctor. But that's why I think the US needs to have a much more positive and proactive approach that's based in peace and equality and justice, which has been lacking in our approach across the administrations, regardless of Democratic or Republican. This has not been a partisan issue. And so we need to really, through our policies, and it starts with things like HR 8050, passing laws that really make clear that we are not going to approach these negotiations with already a pro one side approach in hand.
Is there anything that you'd like to add, Dr. Hamid?
Yes, I think as a Palestinian, so we don't trust the negotiations and the role of the USA in this process, because we try it. Yeah, so from 1991, during President Bush, the father, So when Madrid started in 1991, and they launched the peace process. So it's a process without outcome. So they call it a process. It means seems deliberately. So and during that process, which is going, which is, I think, Netanyahu wants it, to go forever. So there will be a process, but there will be no outcome of that process. So most of the settlements were built during that time. So most of the land, has been stolen by the Israelis. So when Palestinians agree, to have two-state solution according to UN resolutions, and to have independent Palestinian state, according to to the borders of 1967, I think already Palestinians compromised, and accepted less than 1/3 of the historical Palestine. But I think the philosophy and ideology, in Israel is that, what I have is for me, and what you have is for you and me. So you need to negotiate that part. And Abu Mazen believed in peace all over his life. He's working in politics since 60s, and he believed only on negotiations. He was against violent activities, against militarization, and against the weapons. He never carried, he never carried a gun in his hand. And he invested all his time and effort trying to reach to agreement. He compromised the most, but by the end, he reached a conclusion that Americans are not going, to help us find the solution. And I think by behaving in that way, they are losing, their status as mediator, and I don't think they help Israelis in that, because even when the American administration encouraged annexation, this will kill the peace process and will kill any possibilities, and I think, and would kill also the two-state solution. And what will remain that, then what will remain is that people will go more to violence, they will have more, tendency for people to go towards radicalization. Yeah, so I think by behaving in this way, the Americans, are not really helping the Israelis. And also by adopting such philosophy, the Israelis are really behaving against the best interest of Israel. However, the Palestinian government already decided that they cannot continue the peace process unless there is international sponsorship for the negotiation. So it's not going to be the United States alone, and unless there will be the EU is part, Russia is part, China is part, but the USA already lost the trust of the people, and already also it's losing its credibility, and also it's losing really its influence. Imagine, so when Trump is calling Abu Mazen and Abu Mazen is responding, and when Pompeo is calling also Abu Mazen and Abu Mazen is refusing to answer. So I think the status, and the image of America is being lost. So America is losing its credibility, and also it's losing its leadership, I think, in the area by being that biased to Israelis. Even they are more Israelis than the Israelis themselves.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for questions today. I'm sorry to all of you whose questions we weren't able to answer. If you're able to stick around, there will be an opportunity for you to ask them. I would like to have us move on now to a prayer. So if you wouldn't mind joining me in prayer. Dear Lord, we pray for the people of Gaza suffering the ongoing blockade and aerial bombing. We thank you for the resilience of Gazans, and we thank you for the efforts of CMEP to try to lift the Israeli blockade and to bring an end to the suffering and grinding poverty to those trying to survive in Gaza. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Amen. This has been a wonderful opportunity for us to learn about the blockade of Gaza and the annexation of the West Bank, but we believe that knowledge is just the beginning. So with this in mind, we've created an advocacy action for both of the issues we've heard about today that anyone can participate in. It's going to be posted to the chat and also available on the website. So for Gaza, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees provides critical services to 5 million Palestinian refugees, including over half of the population of Gaza. The US historically has been the organization's single largest donor, and it cut its contributions from 360 million to 60 million in 2018, and then down again to 0 starting in 2019. So if you're watching this right now and you're in the United States, we encourage you to reach out via email or phone to your member of Congress and let them know that cutting services to the people of Gaza has only exacerbated the crisis and led us further away from an end to the blockade. With regards to the annexation, similarly, CMEP is currently running, as part of their campaign against annexation, an action to tell Congress to say no to annexation. And you can participate via the link that's going to be shared in the chat, and you can also find out more about this on their website. So if you're located outside the United States, we encourage you to contact your government officials, especially your country's ambassador to Israel. Encourage them to put pressure on Israel to lift the blockade on Gaza and oppose the annexation of the West Bank. We also encourage you to find the most creative ways to get your messages across. Then share your creative messages and the ways you delivered them on social media. To get more attention on your post, include an image of Gaza with a line from your message on it, if you can. Include a link to this page of the Kumi Now website, along with the hashtags Kumi Now and Kumi40. Kyle and Dr. Hamid, do you have any other thoughts about these Kumi actions or other ways that people watching this session can be in solidarity?
No, I would just say we did even very recently have a new alert that I think has now been put in the chat. It was not even out when we had spoken and did our practice run yesterday. So I would encourage those in the US to use that and to really make sure that their members of Congress continue to speak out or start speaking out if they haven't already.
Dr. Hamid, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, really. So I would say that we need your support, really. Yeah, so we are resilient enough and we are strong enough. We believe in our case and we will continue defending it forever. But really, we need your support in order to help us. Yeah, continue. We need your support to help us. Yeah, serve our children. We need your help, really, to help us, really, to support the health of our people, secure their basic needs, especially now with the cut of USAID fund and really the suspension of the support from most Arab countries. Yeah, and with the economic crisis people are facing and the conflicts and war in the different countries of the world, like in Syria and in Libya, there has been a dramatic cut to the support provided to the Palestinians in general. It used to be around $3 billion in 2008. Now it's less than $500 million. Yeah, and I think people needs should not be subject to politics, should not be politicized. So, and I think it's more a responsibility that people who are in need should be supported. So we need support from you. Not only resources, but more importantly, advocacy. We need help. We need you to help us. That people in the world know that we are still occupied, and the Israeli occupation is the last and longest occupation. Now in recent history. Yeah, so we are still occupied by Israel. Yeah, and we are still victims to the oppressions and the policies of Israeli development policies, which is not only taking the land but also destroying the morale and the psychological status of people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid and Kyle, for being with us today. Next week, we're going to be exploring how art is being used as a form of resistance in Palestine. As Fatin Nastas Mitwazi joins us from Dar al-Khalima University College of Arts and Culture, where she is head of the Graphic Design and Applied Arts program. So this is a really exciting session, and we hope to see many of you back here next week. If you like what you've seen today, we would love it if you'd spread the word to friends, family, classmates, church groups, online and through social media. We've now reached the formal end of our meeting, but if you'd like to hang around, our guests have offered to continue to answer questions and chat. This week, we ask that anyone who wants to speak as part of our informal session, raise their hand, and you can do so by clicking on participants on the bottom of your screen and then on raise hand. And Omar will call on you and you'll have about a minute to speak. So again, this ends our formal session, and we look forward to seeing many of you next week. And for those of you who want to stick around, please stay on the call to chat.